Welcome to The Other Coast, a podcast dedicated to the Malifaux meta in Los Angeles. My name is Jeff, and with me here today is another SoCal player, Colgan.
Hey everyone.
Hey Colgan. So today, we thought we would talk about a game that the two of us had recently played and kind of review, how the game went, what we thought we did right, what we thought we did wrong, and if we had any takeaways from it. So to start us off, Colgan, why don't you explain the scenario that we played?
So we generated the game via the app, as I imagine most people do.
Mm-hmm.
I believe the strategy was Symbols of Authority. I don't remember the exact scheme pool. I remember that I took Research Mission and Vendetta, and I believe you had Research Mission and... what was your other scheme?
Spread them out. And then Hidden Martyrs and Take Prisoner were also in the pool, but neither of us picked it.
I've never really liked Take Prisoner, because I feel like I always want to kill the model if I get to the point where I get the reveal.
Yeah, when I look at the scheme pool, I often feel like Take Prisoner is a point I can score because enemies are, often in my face. But then in the game, I have trouble scoring it, so I tend to avoid it now too.
It always feels a little bit weird too, because there's times where it's just easier to remove the model because you're always already going to be engaged with it. And I imagine, especially with the Viktorias, you don't want to be wasting activations just sitting there or just chasing after this one model to grab those points when you could be, setting up for grabbing symbols or just removing my crew and getting that activation advantage.
Right. So I guess actually this is a good point now to talk about the crews we brought. Oh, and the deployment was corner deployment. So I brought the Viktorias, like you just mentioned. So I had declared Outcast. I brought the Viktorias. I also have Vanessa, Hans, the Student of Conflict, Taylor, and 2 Ronin with Servants of Dark Power. And my model selection was strongly influenced by the models that I own. Ordinarily, I think I would have preferred to take probably the Midnight Stalker instead of Taylor. But as it turns out, Taylor was a pretty good model, so I guess I shouldn't complain. And then I had a pool of 5 stone.
Yeah, and on my side, I was running Rasputina. So Rasputina and Wendigo, and then Blessed of December with Magical Training, Snowstorm, 2 Silent Ones, 1 with Magical Training, and 2 Horcats. So for this list, it was kind of more of, I think for me, trying to train myself to play in a style I'm not used to. So I've been playing Rasputina a little bit more since I think recently I've been leaning a lot more towards aggressive crews instead of control crews. So I kind of wanted to see if I could even pull a control crew off. Even more to the point, I wanted to see if I can run Rasputina without an Ice Golem, because I feel like when I do run him, I just kind of lean into his Blizzard and his area of control. And I might not necessarily be using all the tools that Rasputina and Ice Pillars and the Silent Ones bring to the table.
Right. I can say that I was surprised to not see the Ice Golem in your crew. And Hans is just a good model generally. I don't really understand why some people on the forums have been hating on him. But I brought Hans specifically for the Ice Golem, just to layer slow and stunned and distracted on him, and to just try to reduce the efficiency of any Ice Golem that I might end up fighting. And so I was pleasantly relieved when you didn't bring him, but I was also kind of like, well, so now I've got to find a different use for Hans.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting, because I guess during the game, Hans didn't really end up doing much over it, right? Just because of placement, terrain, and Horcats being stealthed.
Right. It was corner deployment, and as is my usual brilliant strategy, I just line up my guys as far as they can go in the deployment zone. So the middle of the board, if I remember right, was dominated by a forest.
Yeah.
Which really stopped Hans's ability to influence the game, because I had deployed him basically right in the middle. With his 4 movement, he couldn't even get to one edge of the forest or the other, really. And so I suppose if you had brought an Ice Golem, he still wouldn't have done anything.
So I guess that's an interesting point to talk about as far as terrain setup. So lately, when I've been setting up terrain, I've been trying out setting up a forest in the center of the map, just to help kind of break line of sight and to force, I guess, movement paths that we don't necessarily see. Because I've noticed a lot in the past, when we do a more standard setup, we'll have blocking terrain and things like that. But I think a lot of people end up just meeting in the center and just getting into a huge scrum that lasts until like turn 3 or 4 when one person emerges the semi-victor.
Right. I would say that having different terrain setups is always a good idea, and it's one way to sort of adjust the value of models and abilities without without actually needing to change a stat line, right?
Mm.
In Malifaux, part of what makes Malifaux such a dynamic game is that not only are models good or bad in sort of a mechanical sense, but the actual conditions on the board can really impact the value of a particular model. In our game, that forest, I should have recognized more clearly the kind of influence Hans would be able to exert if he were somewhere where he could draw a line of sight. I think in my mind I was sort of like, well, if I keep him in the middle, he can affect either side and he won't have to commit. But in practice, because Hans's movement is so low and because that particular piece of forest had the shape it did, I should have put him on just one side or the other and accepted that he's only going to be able to affect things on that side of the board. So that's something I could take away from my deployment. So when we got into the game, as I said, I deployed my guys as far forward as I could, and then I think for the most part you had a pretty forward deployment as well.
Yeah, so, especially with symbols of authority, and I think we basically just placed the symbols as far back as we could. I think we both had like 3 just lined up on our deployment side edge.
Right.
So I felt like I really needed it to be far up if I was going to try and pick up a strap point on turn 2.
Mm-hmm.
And even after that, just to get my guys in position, since I pretty much needed to run them across the entirety of the board.
Right. Uh-huh. And it was actually at this point that I felt something happened that maybe you hadn't necessarily considered at the start, or that I felt that you were forced to react to in a way that maybe you didn't want to, because both my Ronins had Servants of Dark Power, which gave them the Herald ability. So they rolled a push up 6 before we really started, and then in their first turns they also got to move quite a bit. And I noticed that you had responded to that by dropping quite a few ice pillars at the start to try to block their progress. Am I right in my assessment, or had you actually had that been your plan all along?
Well, because I wasn't entirely sure where you would put them, and when they were close enough in range that I felt like I could affect their movement, or at least just slow you down a little bit with ice pillars, I decided to go with that. But I kind of forgot that Ronin have the 3-inch push or 3-inch move at the beginning of the turn. And you did remind me about it, but I was like, well, even with them, because they were behind the wall, I was able to disrupt their movement a decent amount, since you weren't able to just like push through the wall where you wanted to.
Mm-hmm.
And it ended up, at least I think, preventing you from scoring symbols on turn 2, as it felt like you were hoping to get in position for. In retrospect, I think I probably should have just held my actions a little longer, so that when you got in position I could probably just try and remove the Ronins off of the board. And that was one of the things that I didn't really think about. And as I mentioned before, it's like, if I haven't played a master or a crew before, or I guess in this case in a very long time, I don't take a lot of things into consideration, and I make a lot of mistakes, because I kind of went into the game with the mindset of what I wanted to do with Rasputin's crew without really thinking too much about like, well, how's my opponent going to react to it.
Right.
So like I mentioned earlier, I feel like my ice pillar placement, and I guess like my utilization of ice pillars in general, is very subpar when I'm playing Rasputina. So I just kind of wanted to force myself to place as many ice pillar markers as possible to see like, well, how well can I disrupt movement? How many like slows or cards can I force out of the hand with this placement? And like, how should I start thinking about, or is it even worth placing ice pillars preemptively to try and control your movement a bit more?
That's interesting, because from my point of view, actually your pillar placement was pretty effective. It was kind of annoying to me, even though I had battle tempo, which let me almost essentially avoid, I think, for pretty much the entire game, having to make that choice, right, between discarding or having slow. And I was actually counting on battle tempo to be a primary mechanic that was going to allow me to avoid that. And for the most part, those expectations were met. But even so, I felt that the pillars were doing an effective job of, complicating how I would get where I wanted to get. And in fact, in one instance, they completely blocked the line of sight to some actions I wanted to do. So for what it's worth, I found the ice pillars to be pretty annoying.
All right. Cool.
So action started in our game pretty early, and Victoria's activation, I think, really framed what was going to happen for the rest of the game.
Mm-hmm.
And, that would be really early on when I was able, on turn 1, to get a Victoria straight into Raspi's face. And the reason I had made this play was that the activation before, I had used Vanessa, and with intuition, I was able to see that I would have a red joker on a negative damage. I could place the red joker so that it would come up on a negative damage flip.
Mm-hmm.
And I also had a high card that I could use for the attack. I think it was an 11 or a 12. And so I felt confident I could force the attack through, and I could do the red joker. And our crews were far enough away that at that point, I felt confident I wasn't going to have to take a duel on your turn. So I was going to be able to preserve the order that I had assigned. And in fact, that's what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And then I sent Victoria right into your face. She did the 7 damage. And, that felt like a really good interaction. But as we'll discuss later, the 7 damage might not have been that impactful. And, I've been thinking about it since. And I'm wondering if... I don't think I would have had the confidence to make that play if I didn't know I could do the red joker on damage. But because, we'll talk about later the way the damage worked, that might not have been the biggest deal. I'm wondering if that's a hole in the way that I made my assessment, and if the optimal play wouldn't have been to just send her in no matter what damage I could do, like even if it was going to be weak, even maybe if it was going to be black joker damage. What do you think?
So I think it did definitely have an effect on how I played the game, and I think it might have actually been the thing that kind of tipped the game in your favor, because at the beginning of the next turn, on turn 1, towards the end, I'd saved my Blessed of December's movement till kind of the end of the turn, because I wanted to kind of position him aggressively, or her aggressively. I guess I'm not sure which one it is. So that they could be in a good position to be able to score, I guess, strategy next turn. Because at the point, I had a Horcat moving up one side of the board, but I knew they wouldn't be able to get in range and pick up a strategy marker until turn 3. And that was also part of the reason why I had decided to move my Blessed of December more centrally as opposed to along one of the board edges. Because I figured at the very least I could split your attention to be either trying to prevent my Horcat from securing me a strategy point on turn 3, or if you went after the Blessed, then that would also free my Horcat to also score another strategy point, because it would have pulled your forces to the left side of the board.
Right, which in fact did happen.
And when you charged in with the Victoria and you got the 7 damage, and flip red joker on my Rasputina, it kind of put me in the spot where I managed to get initiative on turn 2, and it was a question of whether I wanted to activate my Blessed and move in and secure my strategy point and possibly give you the opportunity to kill Rasputina, because now she was sitting at I prevented 2, so I think she was at 7 HP. And a full activation with Victoria with min 3 damage, even with soul stoning, I wasn't entirely sure she'd be able to survive that activation, but I knew if I activated first, I could get some ice pillars down and use her ice shield ability to ensure that she survived and soaked up more activations, or at least tied you up, and hopefully snowball that into being able to just deny you strategy points.
Right.
So I was assessing the threat. You had Hans and Fiona?
Taylor. Hans, Taylor, and the Student of Conflict.
Yeah. Near the Blessed of December, but I had shielded, which I forgot that Taylor ignored. But, she had 8 health, hard to wound. And in my mind, I was like, well, I feel like Blessed of December can survive at least 1 round. And if you do pull Taylor out of position, I can move, grab the strategy point, and then I won't have to worry about Taylor on turn 3. Since, you would have had to move further towards the center of the board, away from your strategy markers all along your back line, in order to get damage in on the Blessed.
Right.
So I felt it was kind of a hard decision, but I decided to prioritize Rasputina because once Rasputina is gone, the ice pillar effect is gone, and I feel like a lot of the pressure that it can generate with ice pillars is reduced.
Mm-hmm.
Looking back though, I think, like obviously 2020, but
Sure.
I think it would have definitely been the right choice to keep the Blessed, move up, and grab the strategy point, even if Rasputina died, because I really could have just used Ice Pillars to drop next to these symbols and kind of force you to remove them before you do the interactions, like even without the slow associated with them. And especially because of your Battle Temple and on the move abilities, it made it very difficult for me to try and place pillars in a way that it would actually force you into the decision of either gaining slow or having to discard a card.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. So if I had only done min damage on the Victoria's attack on the first turn, would you have felt confident in activating the Blessed?
Oh yeah, 100%. If you had done min damage, I probably would have stoned since I had a cache of 7 stones.
Mm-hmm.
So, that would have been at most like 2 damage, maybe 1 or 0. But even then, if I'm sitting at like 9 HP on Raspy, the chances of you being able to kill Raspy in a single activation Victoria is really low, especially with, being able to stone for damage.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, like the damage would build up and possibly, at that point, I'm still at the point that you charge in with the Victoria into Rasputina. I was like, well, she might survive like another turn or two, but as long as she's eating up activations or I'm able to now use strat points while scoring mine, I'm kind of fine with that.
Mm-hmm.
And especially as the game went on, like just the difficulty in trying to get value out of those pillars in a more preemptive fashion, as opposed to just using it purely to like, I guess, build giant ice walls around my symbols and then just letting you like run through my crew and kill them. Because, at the end of it, if I was able to deny strategy on 1 or 2 turns while my Horkat and my Blessed are able to wreak havoc in your backline, well, just grabbing symbols and securing me points, then, it might have been enough to like get a tire or secure me the win, even if everyone else in my crew is dead at that point.
Right, right. For my part, I would say that if you had activated the Blessed first, that probably would have induced me to do the chain activation for the Victorias and really have poured all of my effort into trying to kill Raspy before she could activate.
Right.
Which I'm not sure would have actually even been the right play for me. As it turned out, like, spoiler alert, I don't think I ever did another point of damage to Raspy because you were able to like generate enough ice pillars to absorb the hits. And at some point, I kind of realized intellectually that I was just treading water against Raspy, right? You were just putting up ice pillars and I was just hitting you and knocking him down to absorb damage.
Mm-hmm.
But, thinking back now about the game, even though I didn't realize this intellectually, I think I did realize emotionally on a certain level that trying to use both Vix to attack Raspy wasn't the right move, because as it turns out, that's actually not what happened, right? Like my other Victoria, I don't think ever made another attack, right? Like she positioned she picked up a marker, a strategy marker on one turn,
right.
And then on another turn she provided kind of a threat vector that you had to address to score points, and then I think she ended up killing a silent one or something before we called the game. But it's it's interesting to me that was not an intellectual process. It's not like I looked at the board and looked at Raspy and looked at what my people could do and was like, yeah, I don't think it's worth it. It's just on some instinctual level, I appreciated that I really wasn't making much progress against Raspy, and I went another way. And so it's funny to hear that, if you had taken kind of the riskier play for yourself, it very well may have sucked me into just a totally bad idea.
Yeah, that is kind of interesting because at the end of that turn, I recall that I believe your original plan with the Servant of Darkness was to get your Ronin in positions to score.
Mm-hmm.
But how it ended up in turn 2 is the only way that you could actually pick up a symbol was by using your master activation.
Right.
And running and picking up the marker. So conversely, if I had secured strat point and then you had gone all in on Rasputina, even if you had killed her, you would not have scored strategy that turn.
Mm-hmm.
And then, I would have pretty reliably been able to get strat on turn 3.
Mm-hmm.
Whether or not you could have gone in on strat 3, it's really hard to say. But perhaps if Rasputina had died, I would have thought about protecting the symbols, because I'm like, well, there's no way I can kill Victorias And with only 2 silent ones, I don't think I have the ice pillar output to effectively like locking your crew or to like pulse out slows or anything like that. So maybe I would have been like, oh, maybe I can just use this to block interactions and then just, kind of throw Snowstorm or anything else I had to just kind of slow it down while my Horcat and my Blessed in the backline just kind of kept trying to secure me my strategy points for the game.
Right, right. So to clarify, because we are talking about this and without maps, it might be difficult for listeners to follow. But so what actually ended up happening is on turn 2, you activated Raspy and you created some pillars, and that would provide the buffer later to survive my attacks. But what it also did is it gave me the opportunity to activate Taylor and charge into the Blessed of December and kill him at the very start of turn 2. And then that denied you the ability to score the strategy that turn, and it
Right.
left you relying on the Horcat. And it also, I think, there was no way I could stop the Horcat from scoring in the future because there was one strategy marker that was too far away from me and he was super close to it. But I think what it ended up doing was it very much reduced your scoring options in the future, right? Because you basically had that Horcat and you had another coming down the board, but I did have Hans in position who could potentially do something about that. So what it meant is that while there was one strategy marker that was totally free for you, the other 3 were going to be a bit of a challenge for you to work through.
Right.
And conversely, on your side of the board, ultimately because of the movement the Viktorias offered, I was able to pick up some strategy markers, even though you were doing an effective job of defending the closer ones. The crew was just so mobile that I was able to pick out some of the farther away ones.
Yeah, and again, that's one of those things that it's just nice to play against these masters and have a quick refresher course.
Mm-hmm.
Just like having all the start of activation places between Victoria and Vanessa was able to, just kind of warp, you got a lot of free movement and you're able to reposition very rapidly.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't have enough setup time to actually effectively protect enough markers by just surrounding them with ice pillars.
Right. Pretty much all your ice pillars, well, not all, because some of them were effectively blocking out some of my movement or vision, but a lot of them were being used to absorb damage from Raspy, right? So you had to tie them pretty close to her. And in fact, I recall at one point you had the Snowstorm use his activation to go back and defend a marker, which, stopped the primary way I was planning on scoring, but I was actually able to score that turn by going to a farther away marker.
Right.
And so it ended up being kind of a lot of stones worth of, like, he was basically an ice pillar in that circumstance, right? And so that's paying quite a bit for just an ice pillar. I think the rest of the game is pretty easy to describe. We got into a scrum on turn 1, which didn't really turn out the way either of us expected, but ended up having a pretty big impact on the rest of the game. And then it was down to just kind of picking off the odd point. Research mission, we both scored, and then I was able to spread them out, again, because my guys had a bunch of mobility. And for you, I think Vendetta became impossible at some point.
Yeah, because I took it on my silent one against your Fiona, which I thought...
Or Taylor.
Oh, Taylor, yes. Why do I keep calling her Fiona? Which I was like, well, he has Taylor. She has a hammer. He's probably going to, like, charge in with the rest of his crew, because that's kind of what the Vics do.
Uh-huh.
And I figured that I would have been able to just get enough ping damage off on her. And, with the silent ones being able to target through pillars. But, it's basically an effective threat extender. So I'd just be able to ping her and grab Vendetta. And I figured Fiona was something I would want to try and kill or remove at Taylor. God damn it. Taylor would be someone I would want to remove in the future. I think overall it was just... I was trying to go with a more scheme-oriented playstyle, but my gut still just thought in my mind was like, oh yeah, I can just kill stuff. Like, I have a crew. I can kill things. Part of it was, I think it's good, and I do want to keep playing more games with Raspy just so I can kind of force myself into a different playstyle. But it's going to take a little bit to kind of unlearn that instinct or just, like, reset those expectations. Like, no... Like, you intentionally didn't bring any damage, but, like, in the back of my mind, I'm still like, well, I don't need that much.
I could say that when, after the game, when you had revealed that you had Vendetta, I was very surprised. Just because, for one thing, it was the silent one that was the furthest possible distance from Taylor that had it. You had one on the other, on actually her side of the board, that would have been close enough to maybe do some attacks at some point. But the other one, the way the game folded, and especially with that forest in the middle, which ended up being an issue for Hans, but it also would have complicated trying to use ice pillars to see through. I was really surprised that you had taken Vendetta against Taylor with that model. I mean, your overall reasoning, I think, was really good, and normally Taylor would probably have been with the rest of my crew, but in this game, I had planned to use Taylor because she has so much extra movement. She has the battle tempo, and then her charge gives her plus 2 inches of movement. So I was kind of like, she was my plan to try to defend my markers, or at least complicate your movement math in trying to get to them safely. And then once the Blessed like basically charged down the middle of the board, that sort of cemented Taylor's destiny to spend the entire game on my table half.
Right.
So I noticed you had given the Blessed magical training, and how did you feel that worked? I mean, obviously Taylor was immune to shielded, but how did you feel that worked out as opposed to maybe Soulstone Cache as a defense?
Well, obviously in this case it didn't work well at all, right?
Well, Taylor can also ignore Soulstones.
Oh, right, she has a trigger for that.
Yeah, she has a trigger for that. But I mean, just in terms of, how you felt magical training worked as something that you've taken for defense instead of a card, because it's something I do very regularly with Colette, but we don't really see it a lot in lists like online and stuff, and that's generally an indication that I'm wrong. So I'm wondering what what you kind of thought of it as a defense mechanism.
So I do like magical training in that, obviously I don't have to burn extra soul stones to reduce damage. I think shielded is usually like a decent deterrent, and having counterspell is always really nice to, discourage people from declaring triggers, or at least forcing them to pay for it. In general, I think that I don't like running Soulstone Cache purely as a defensive thing, because I'm not able to get the points back from things dying around me if I'm putting out a model that I'm just trying to keep alive. And just, using soul stones purely with the intention of negating a bit of damage, I feel like I might be losing a little bit of value. Well, I guess I should also think about using it a little bit more offensively with the Blessed, since, I can ensure certain triggers, and I think she has... They. I could get a little bit more movement, or if I do end up fighting something that's a little bit squishier, with the 2-4-6 damage track and then Onslaught, I can potentially put out quite a bit of damage.
Right. I've actually noticed a lot of people don't really seem to like the Blessed very much. And I have not played Raspi in third myself. And when I played against Raspi, I've actually generally found the Blessed to be kind of a weak spot in the opponent's crew, or at least they don't seem to get really that much value from the Blessed. What do you think of the Blessed as a model?
It has a lot of mobility, but I think what happens with me is I think she's always able to take more punishment. They can always take more punishment.
No, looking at the art, I'm pretty sure it's a she.
Oh, okay. Now we're just gonna change this.
Well, I mean, I didn't have the art open before, but now I mean,
I'm just gonna use they because
she's gonna have back problems in later life. I mean, I'll just say that much.
Anyways, well, how do you know? Maybe that's that's part of the blessing, right?
Because her triggers look good. I mean, I look at her on paper, and it seems like this should be a model that's effective at killing, like annoying scheme runners and stuff like that. But then in practice, it seems like she often gets used as like a frontline beater or something, and so I see Raspi players struggle to get a lot of value from her. So I'm wondering what you think of where her place is in the Raspi crew.
Yeah, I really think that she should be kind of running schemes for you or hunting enemy scheme runners. I think the issue becomes that it can get a little bit muddled because they kind of step into both realms, and I think for me I didn't commit enough to one or the other. So I could have placed her, on the left flank, and they would have been a pretty good deterrent, I think, against Ronins just trying to blitz towards one of my strategy markers. Right. Since she's able to keep up with them in movement. As far as offense, I think she can match them. And, with Onslaught, I have a decent chance of pushing through the hard to kill as well.
Right.
Or, at the very least, tie them up and then with their push at the end turn, kind of keep moving up the board after just taking a little bit away from your movement. She also has the built-in push on her attack.
Yep.
Like the Blessed just have a lot of things, and I'm just not that great at Raspy. We'll put that out there. I think that it has potential. The issue that I run into a lot of it is like halfway through the turn, I'm like, oh, I can do so many things with this model that I
Right.
end up just kind of having it trying to threat too many things at once and then overexposing it and it just dying or not actually targeting things for denial or not committing it enough for scoring. Because I
Right.
think in this game, running up the middle wasn't necessarily bad, but I needed to commit to the idea that it's a scheme runner now. I can't expose it to any extraneous damage.
Mm-hmm.
Or I should have just run it up the flank like I did with my Horcats so that Taylor would have had to spend an entire activation even trying to get to the Blessed and only having one attack.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that next turn, I just push away, leap, move, and then Taylor won't be able to catch up.
Yeah, no, that's true. For me, I think what I see quite often is that Raspi players will have an ice golem, and you don't have an ice golem in this game, but they get kind of lured into this, I don't know, dream scenario where the ice golem has its hazardous aura up, and the blessed jumps up, does damage, pushes the target, they take more damage from the hazardous aura, right? And so this guy is just able to demolish enemy masters in a single activation.
Mm.
And in practice, I haven't really seen the December manage to do that the Blessed December managed to do that very successfully. And I mean, I have to agree with you that I think if you had placed it in the flank with the Horcat, or even replaced the Horcat with it, right? Like sent the Horcat up the middle and had her, the Blessed, on the side, that would have been much more difficult for me to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, so I guess to kind of summarize the rest of the game, Taylor killed the December for basically for free. And we're a couple turns of jockeying for position, and we traded scoring, but at a somewhat more favorable rate. And then we ultimately called it mid-turn 4 when I think I had killed a silent one, and there really wasn't that much on the board left for you, and it looked like I was going to be able to just kind of use my extra model advantage at that point just to score basically an unassailable lead. And so we thought the game would probably be like a 2 or maybe, at the outside like a 3-point difference. So I guess, first of all, how was your experiment with not running the ice golem?
I learned a lot from the game,
Mm-hmm.
and I still want to keep trying out the ice golem because, I mean, I don't think like, oh, this is the optimal way to play Raspy.
Sure.
Having the ice golem, he gives so much pressure if you drop his aura. Like he could have definitely controlled the center of the board. I think if I brought him in this game, if you had gone in Raspy, I could have just, all right, I'll just my ice golem just pop his aura.
Right.
And then if you want to, swing 3 times against Raspy, like go for it. And I think, that would have given me a lot more breathing room to just prioritize scoring strategy, knowing that, okay, even if Rasputin is down, like I have my Ice Golem there to kind of eat up actions or just pulse out and kind of force you to avoid this, 2 damage hazardous area.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the Ice Golem is a phenomenal model and can have a great influence on the board. If you continue to play without the Ice Golem, the Ice Golem is 10 stones, right? It's not cheap, so not using it does give you a lot of other options.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think you would pretty much keep the same crew, or are there like some changes that you might make? I mean, obviously it's going to depend on the matchup and the deployment as well, but just in terms of the models that you brought and how they work together, were you satisfied with that? And you think it's just bit of refinement in positioning, and that your basic template worked?
I also really wanted to run this to see if I could get value out of Horcats in like comparison to Ice Dancer, who I think, are like the 2 other scheming models in Rasputina's crew.
Mm-hmm.
So previously I'd run Ice Dancer and it was just very underwhelming. Like they have Butterfly Jump, which is nice, but with no other defensive tech and only 6 HP, it felt like in most cases, if my opponent was gunning for my Ice Dancer, I would get 1 Butterfly Jump off and then they'd be dead.
Right.
And, for like 6 points, it didn't feel like a great investment, especially, 6 movement is nice. And she has the potential of, like moving up to 16 inches if you have like ice pillars placed perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
But with the rest of Rasputina's crew having such low mobility, trying to get those ice pillars placed in a way that you're getting maximum movement out of your ice dancer is very difficult. And when you do that, most of the time it's placing ice pillars in areas that's not actually having effect in slowing down the enemy crew or threatening for slow or causing them to lose cards.
Right, right. I have not used the Ice Dancers in third edition, but in second edition, as a Colette main, pretty much a Colette only, in fact, I virtually never brought them. I brought the Oiran, who are now the Kunoichi, far more often than I brought the Ice Dancers.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like I brought the Oiran a lot either. It's just they had this aura that could help with willpower duels, and in the meta of second edition, Rotten Bells had just a broken stat 8 lure. It was ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And so, things you could do to give your guys willpower bonuses could definitely have an outsized effect. In third edition, although I haven't played Colette very much intentionally because I want to play a wider variety of masters in third, but I have never really considered bringing them, and I don't think that they're very good models, and I think that they need something else to make their movement tricks more reliable.
Yeah, I would agree. I feel like Horcats can be pretty useful, like having manipulative and stealth and a 6-inch move for 5 points. I think they have their place. I don't think it's worth taking two of them because I honestly felt like a hard time figuring out where I should have put my second Horcat to be in
Mm-hmm.
a place that was effective. My original idea was I'd have them run up both flanks of the board, but after your deployment and after initial movement, it felt like you were leaning heavy on the left side of the board, whereas the right side of the board was more or less open. And I didn't really see any way for my Horcat to kind of like sneak through without just catching a blade and dying really quickly.
Right, right. Or, I mean, disguised or stealth was effective against Hans within six, but later in the game, I think your Horkat that went down the middle would have been in range of Hans, and Hans has Ruthless, so manipulative would not have helped against him.
So I guess to answer your question, as far as like changes I would make to the crew, if I not running the ice golem, I think I really need to dip kind of into the out of faction or sorry, out of keyword or versatile model pool a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
because I think when I'm looking at I'm running two silent ones. I ran December acolytes a couple of times, but they're also very underwhelming. Kind of feels like the ice dancer. Like I'm not entirely sure what I should be using them for. Like they have deploy from the shadow or from the shadows as deployment, but with their kit and the low mobility of the rest of my keyword, I felt like I'm not really able to take advantage of that advanced position
Right.
since I'm trying to play catch up and drop ice pillars. And even then, like they don't really have any defensive tech. Their offensive abilities are a little bit wanting.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like their place really is just as a tech pick against, like a heavily armored crew or someone with a lot of shielded just for analyze weakness.
Mm-hmm.
But even then, I think outside of the ice golem, your ability to threat damage or remove models with Rasputina isn't that high.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot of ping damage, which doesn't necessarily benefit so much from Analyze Weakness.
Right.
And of course, the ice golem. I mean, the ice golem is very strong, but he can't be everywhere at once, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I would agree with you there. In fact, I want analyze weakness is definitely not useless, but it's one of those things where on paper it's a counter, and on the table, it's much harder to use effectively.
I think like part of it too is because you're effectively going to say you're dedicating, I think usually at least 2 models worth of activations to try and get value out of it. Because the first model drop analyze weakness. I think most models with analyze weakness aren't necessarily threats in and of themselves as far as like a damage threat.
Right.
Even if you're able to get analyze weakness off on like an armor 2 model, it's not like your next attack will kill it. Because in most cases, I feel like if they're that low, it's almost more efficient just to attack twice and not
Right.
bother with the analyze weakness. So analyze weakness is like you need to go early or early enough that you're able to commit your other models to killing this thing. And in a lot of cases, depending on the strat and scheme pool, I feel like, it's better, especially with Arcanist, maybe just grab a Mech Arachnid with Precise, and then you don't have to deal with all this setup. Or you just toss in a model or slow down their beater, especially with Rasputina, you just pass out some slow and staggered, and you just move around it.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. And I mean, I know, just like how I mentioned, my picks were influenced by my model collection. In your case, inexplicably, you do not own Soulstone miners. And so, it's just saying, well, replace a Horkat with a Soulstone miner may not be very helpful. But that could also potentially, I think, be an effective change.
I think that's another thing that I've been thinking about more is whether or not I should commit to a faction. I kind of feel like I should, or at least like pick up versatiles for one. But ever since I started the game, I just been jumping from like master to master just to try out like the asymmetric play styles and stuff like that. And honestly, I think I've mentioned this before. Like every time we're going down to play and we're making up our list, I'm always like, oh man, I wish I had this master that I could play. And then after I get them, like it doesn't end. Like once I have that master, I play like one game, I'm like, oh, I should really get like Kurai or something like that.
Yeah, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. The variety is, I think, a major draw in Malifaux, right? I mean, we both play 40k, and we talked about this a little bit, how, in 40k, everything is basically on the same continuum. There's not really such a thing as an asymmetrical playstyle in 40k, and that's very much not true in Malifaux. And so, yeah, as someone who does own a ton of different masters and someone who intentionally has not committed to maining one, I mean, I'm right there with you. And now, fortunately, since I've been playing since second, I do have a nice collection of the versatiles. But, I can say, as you're, someone who's played you a couple of times, the fact that you are always such a challenging opponent and typically the winner, even with a pretty restricted model pool, means that maybe I shouldn't be so enthusiastic for you to expand into versatiles.
Well, when Explorer Society comes out, my eye will keep wandering. There's going to be like 8 more masters, so, you don't have to worry about it. Unless they all end up being like super overpowered.
Oh, geez, how could that ever happen? I mean, there's no reason that we could ever suspect that any Explorer Society thing could be overpowered. It's not like they publicly released anything that looked broken or worrisome.
I mean, that aside, though, like, seeing like the art leaks for the Nocturnes and stuff like that, I really like the art direction they're going with it.
Yeah, English Ivan looked really good.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of your crew, was there a model that you felt was like an MVP for you, a standout?
I think the Horcats ended up performing a lot better than I thought they would.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's a little hard to say MVP since I lost the game fairly decisively, but I think I was positioned in such a way that it was really a couple of activations and like activation priority that kind of pulled me from a close game to kind of like domination.
I mean, I would actually say that to me, your MVP model is actually the silent one that had Vendetta, because she produced a lot of ice pillars for Raspi, and it took me a full turn, right? Like a couple of models, I think 2 Ronin and one of the Vics attacking Raspi before I realized, like, wait a minute, this is really stupid. And in a way, when you activate it, so this actually goes back to our activation episode, right, where we kind of talk about revenge activations. In a way, when you activated the silent one and you made more pillars, I was like, okay, I'm going to activate my Ronin, I'm going to attack Raspi, I'm going to do damage, I'm going to get through these pillars, and then Viktoria's, going to have some hits in the clear, which, even if I'd managed to get ahead of you in the ice pillar race, which I think I pretty much only broke even, you still had stones. Raspi still had, 7 health, so it's not like I was going to, suddenly kill her the second your last ice pillar died. But that silent one creating more pillars mentally tied me more to the fight, because I saw you spending more resources to keep Raspi up, and so I felt that I was getting closer when I was really, like, it was just quicksand. I was just struggling and getting myself in deeper. You mentioned that it was maybe your deployment that cost what was potentially a close game into a more lopsided one. And I mean, I would agree that maybe like we talked about with the Blessed, there was a way maybe to use it better. But I would say that for me, it was finally realizing that I was wasting my time with Raspi that really gave me the chance to secure the win. And your silent one actually prevented me from getting to that realization. So I would have to give that model MVP status.
I would also like to posit that I truly hope that there was a better way to use the Blessed instead of having it die after one activation. Like, that would be my sincere hope.
I mean, as it turned out, Taylor is kind of a perfect made model for that mission, though. You know, because she had the puncture, which I did have to discard for, but it canceled your hard to wound. Because I remember I got straight flip on damage. I managed to cheat in a severe and just do a ton. And ordinarily, it should be quite hard, I think, for a lot of models to wipe out the Blessed December with shielded in one activation.
Right.
So Taylor, coincidentally, who I didn't want to take, and I seem to recall complaining about having to take her at the table. You know, because you always gotta, like, get in your justification for why you lose before any card has been flipped.
Right.
Because I recall you offered to let me use your Midnight Stalker. Because you have
my
one
painted Midnight Stalker.
Yeah, painted Midnight Stalker. But I did not, and Taylor ended up maybe being my MVP because she really complicated your scoring effort. So even though she didn't score any points herself, she ended up having an outsized influence on the game, in my opinion. What about, you know, for you looking at my crew, are there any models that you would kind of point to, or do you agree that it was Taylor?
So I'm just gonna kind of go through my thoughts. I felt like the Ronin kind of didn't really do anything.
That one Ronin on the bottom absorbed a lot of activations for a turn. Like the one that was fighting the Silent One and the Snowstorm.
Oh.
So remember, you got it down to like 1 health. Then it came up, it killed the Wendigo, which gave it 2 more health and got it above hard to kill.
Right.
But for 1 turn at least, it really jammed. And because there was that building there, so there was no way to really get past the Ronin for the Snowstorm. And that kept the Snowstorm from the main fight for a turn. So, I mean, that's something, I guess.
I suppose that's true. I would want to say Vanessa didn't do much, but she was the one that made it so you knew that the Red Joker was coming. And I do feel like that Red Joker put a lot of pressure and kind of dictated my activations following it.
Her by your side also, I think, it made it so I could score that strat point.
Yeah, I definitely underestimated just like how much incidental placement that you had in Vic's crew. Like between Behind Your Back and then like Sisters in Spirit and things like that. I think I also probably responded. I guess it depends. I feel like I might have like spent too many resources trying to keep Rasputina alive when I really should just have the idea like, all right, I'll just, you know, place enough to kind of slow it down or like keep her on board for another turn rather than just like dumping as much as I could just to make sure that she stayed on the board. Because, you know, as I stated before, in the end, I thought it was very difficult to actually get the value out of the aura on the pillars that I was hoping for.
Right.
And that it might have been just as effective to just barricade my symbols in ice pillars.
I mean, that would have been a very different approach, so I think it's hard to evaluate them.
Right.
So, you know, I've talked again about how I was just in quicksand and I wasted a lot of activations attacking Raspi. And part of what made that dynamic so favorable for you was that Raspi was able to create pillars at 2 for an action, right?
Right.
And I think, you know, you had a cache of 7 stones, and you ended up spending a lot of them on that action to create more damage absorbers, right? So even if there may have been, quote-unquote, better uses for Raspi, at least as long as I was pouring attacks into you, like, I felt you were getting much greater value out of Raspi's efficiency than I was out of my attacking model.
I mean, I guess on that line of play, if I had positioned a little bit better and I was able to actually deny you the strat point on, was it turn 2? It should have been turn 2.
Yeah.
Or even on turn 3 when I was placing those ice pillars and then you had to place with a judgment. If I was able to deny you a point on at least turn 2 or turn 3, then I might have been able to fight for the tie.
Yeah.
Since you had poured so many resources in to try and kill Raspi, and I just kind of like dumped ice pillars around her. Yeah. So I do think that there was a way for me to at least get a tie from that position if I had executed things a little bit better.
Yeah, this might be one of those instances where an unexpected event occurs that has an outsized influence on the whole game, right? And I mean, I don't know if for you, like, it was an emotional response at all, but for me, you know, when I saw that Red Joker, I was like, 7 damage on Raspi, you know, and like my vision just went red, right? It was just like, I'm gonna Alpha Strike Raspi, and then I'm gonna remove her from the board, and then I'm gonna steamroll you. And rational thought, like, more or less evaporated at the point that I saw the red Joker.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was such a big play that I definitely should have evaluated it more clearly. Like, definitely in terms other than, oh, I can do 7 damage to Raspy.
Mm-hmm.
Because as we talked about, it might have been the right play no matter how much damage I could do. Or it might have just been this wrong play that stuck me in quicksand. Or it might have been something where, yeah, I should have gone in on Raspy, but I shouldn't have kept attacking her, right? I should have just used it as kind of like this springboard to get deeper onto your side to then kind of spread out and score points. Because what ended up happening is that I dove in, and then, how you mentioned my run and really didn't do anything. That would have been a great opportunity for me to just sort of scatter my crew to the 4 winds and just concentrate on picking up markers and dropping the ski markers I needed for my stuff. And you might have had a hard time running me down. Sure, the table wouldn't have been as advantageous for me, but I might have scored more points with that kind of strategy.
Right, like just to the point where I couldn't even catch up.
Right.
Yeah, and this is just one of the interesting things. It's like those few activations, depending on like how it would responded, I think would have ended up in entirely different games. And it's hard to say what the correct choice would have been, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
If you had made that play regardless of the red Joker and say, I think we discussed this, you got minimum damage on Raspy, I would have definitely felt comfortable, and I probably would have just activated my blesses and secured my strategy point, because I think with positioning, I wasn't sure if you're able to get your, because there's a range limit on the chain activation for the Viktorias, no? Or
yeah, I think there is. I think it's like 6, but let me check because I have the app. Yeah, within 6.
Right, I believe, and I may be wrong, that with how it was positioned, that you wouldn't have been able to get a chain activation off of the Viktorias on that turn.
Oh, that might be true. I don't know for sure, but yeah, I can't remember anymore. But that very well could be true.
So having the red Joker, to me, it put me in this pressure moment. It's like, well, with only 7 HP left, like there's a decent chance that if you activate Raspy before I'm able to get up, or if you activate the Viktorias before I'm able to get some ice pillars up around Raspy, then that could be the end of Raspy in exchange for the strategy point. And is that really worth it? So if you had gone in regardless and done that damage, and maybe it still would have been enough, because after I secure that strategy point, I would have gone in and kind of built up those pillars. But I would imagine also the mindset where you're like, well, I'm just going to get in to try and pull some resources and then just jump back out, spread out, after I force him to drop ice pillars to protect his master, as opposed to preventing movement or protecting the strategy points.
Mm-hmm.
That you would have been in a very strong position to just pick up the more central strategy points that are easier to defend and then move off to the sides, because I didn't really have much of a range threat outside of just Rasputina. And you could have easily just thrown in a Ronin there just to keep Rasputina busy in close combat.
Right.
And then I would have just been struggling to try and catch up to your masters or try to slow them down in some way.
Right. I do think at one point you might have had a notion of trying to use her more offensively, because I recall you took 1 disengage action with her.
Oh, I attempted to, yeah.
Oh yeah, and after that didn't work. I mean, you didn't try it again, right? But I wonder if at that moment you were like, oh well, I'll get free, and then I'll do her gun action and slow basically as much of your crew as I can reach, and haha.
Oh, my original plan was, because of where she was positioned, it was kind of blocking my snowstorm and my other units from supporting her effectively. So I was like, well, I can disengage with her and then I can just drop a pillar so that your Vic can't just like get a straight charge, and you have to at least move in charge.
Right.
And if you had moved in charge with a Vic, then I was pretty sure it would have opened up a charge lane for my snowstorm, or at least my snowstorm could have just thrown ice tornadoes to pulse damage onto your Vic and just push Rasputina further out. But where it was positioned, I wasn't able to actually get an ice tornado in a way that I would have gotten enough movement away that I could effectively hide Rasputina from your Vic or for like a charge. So it's like, well, if I'm only able to get out of my engagement and you just activate your Vic, charge, attack, I'm not actually gaining anything from this.
Right. Yeah, no, makes sense.
So the original hope was, that I could push out, drop a pillar, and then I would have enough space that I could just rearrange things with ice tornadoes.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I mean, for me, kind of the most interesting thing about the game, and I don't want to repeat myself, but I'm a pretty cautious player. I don't like to just throw my models into the middle of the enemy crew. Alpha strike styles are not really my play style.
Right.
And so this red joker had just an outsized impact on the way I played the game. And so the takeaway for me really should be that we've said on other episodes that you should kind of have a reason for why you do things. I didn't have a reason for why I did that, and so that indicates maybe a hole in my play. And it also also because because the Alpha Strike was valuable here, I should maybe reassess. I'm not overnight gonna turn into like a Nekima player or anything like that. But I do think that a known issue with my playstyle is that I am a bit more loss averse, and so that frequently impacts my model selection and my action selection. And that's my takeaway from the game. What about you? Do you have any takeaway? Hire the Ice Golem?
I mean, now that you mention it, I'm kind of curious, like, how much that played into it, right? Because I do think, I guess as far as playstyles, I'm a much more aggressive player. So whenever I play Rasputina, I end up playing her very aggressively. So me moving up Rasputina, like, I don't think she was exposed to turn one, because you had to, like, move, charge, such that you only had one attack.
Right.
It also kind of plays in that. Like, I played Rasputina, who's, like, traditionally should be a defensive master, more aggressively than usual. And I think I also kind of expected you to play the Vix more defensively for your usual playstyle. So in my mind, it's like, well, he's not going to, try and charge in turn one. Like, his guys are so far back. Like, I'm not even sure if he has enough movement to do this, frankly. But you did end up going, flipping the red joker, and it was just like, oh shit, just going for the kill. What's going on? I think my takeaway is that I guess I don't have a solid takeaway as far as, like, what I'm going to do with Rasputin in the future. I think that I do want to keep playing her. I do want to keep focusing on more, I guess, scheme heavy crews and not taking the Ice Golem, because I feel like taking the Ice Golem, then I just kind of fall back into my very aggressive play style and not really accomplishing, trying to, like, temper my play style a bit more, or at least getting more insight into how to play a more control focused game. And I guess part of it too is wondering if that's even a route worth pursuing, right? If my playstyle benefits from being more aggressive, is it not more effective just to spend my time playing more aggressive crews that I'm going to pick up faster and I'm going to be understanding faster than Rasputina?
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Well, it was definitely a very interesting game that I thoroughly enjoyed. And who knows, maybe the Vix will see a little bit more play in the future.
Bloodthirsty Jeff.
So, Colgan, thanks for the discussion, and of course, thanks for the game. For those of you who have listened, thank you very much. We appreciate it. We play down here in Southern California, but we would like to be part of the wider Malifaux community, and that's one reason why we're doing this podcast. And if you enjoyed it, please consider giving us a like or a comment or a subscribe. We love receiving any and all feedback, and we got some voicemails over Anchor, and those were super cool. We have Reddit, we have Discord, we have Facebook, we have website, we have all those things. And so basically whatever format you'd like to reach out to us, we would really just love to hear from you. And if you have any opinions about what we said, if you think there are things you'd like to hear us cover, if you're curious at all about our meta, anything like that. We also have a PayPal and a Patreon. The links are in the show notes. So if you'd like to support the channel in that way, that would also be super cool. Otherwise, that's going to be it for us for tonight. And I'll say good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.